The kitchen floor was cold at 6 in the morning. It was always cold. Grace Holloway had known this for 38 years, the way the marble pulled the warmth from the soles of her feet, the moment she stepped off the bedroom rug. The contractor who installed it had called it Calicata, Italian, quarried from a mountain somewhere that had been standing for millions of years before anyone thought to cut it into slabs and lay it in the kitchen of a house in the West Hills of Portland, Oregon, so that a woman could stand on it in bare feet at 6 in the morning and feel the cold move up through her bones. She remembered standing in the showroom while Warren pointed at samples the way he did when a decision had already been made, and her agreement was simply a formality to move through. She had touched several of the samples. She had said things about light and warmth and whether stone was really the right choice for a kitchen floor. Warren had listened with the particular attentiveness of a man who has already decided and is waiting for the objections to run their course. The Calicata had been installed the following March. She had learned to move through a great many things. The refrigerator hummed its low and indifferent hum. Outside, the first gray light of a November morning was beginning to press itself against the windows that looked out over the back garden, the garden that a landscaping company maintained on a quarterly contract, arriving every 3 months, with their trucks and their equipment, and their professional indifference shaping everything into the same careful geometry, cutting back whatever had grown beyond its designated space. The garden looked in every season exactly the same, as if nothing in it was permitted to surprise anyone, as if surprise itself was a kind of disorder to be managed. Grace stood at the kitchen counter with a piece of paper in her hand. She had been standing there for 14 minutes. She knew this because the clock above the range had ticked its way through each one of them, steady and uninterested, the way clocks are when the people beneath them are falling apart. 14 minutes. She had not moved. She had not put the paper down. She had simply stood with it in both hands, reading the same lines over and over, not because she needed to read them again, but because her body had not yet received the instruction to do anything else. The paper was a receipt. A hotel downtown, one of the newer ones that had gone up in the Pearl District 6 or 7 years ago. The kind with a rooftop bar and a restaurant on the lobby level, where the lighting was designed to make everyone look like they were somewhere important, somewhere worth being seen. The kind of hotel where the rooms cost more per night than most families spent on groceries in a week, and where that price was understood to include a particular kind of discretion. Warren Holloway's name was at the top. 14 nights, last month. She read the dates again. November 3rd through the 16th. She had been in the house every one of those 14 nights. She had made dinner. She had watched the news. She had read in bed until the lamp on her side of the room went off. And then she had lain in the dark, listening to the neighborhood settle into its nighttime sounds, the occasional car, the distant train, the particular silence of a well-insulated house that costs what this house had cost. She had been here, and Warren had been somewhere that was not here 14 nights running, checking into a hotel downtown under his own name, because it had not occurred to him that the receipt would end up in her hands. Or perhaps it had occurred to him, and he had decided it didn't matter. She set the paper down on the counter slowly, carefully, the way you set something down, when your hands know they are being watched, even when no one is watching. This was not the first time she had stood in this kitchen, holding a piece of paper that told her something she did not want to know. The first receipt had appeared 14 months ago on a Thursday morning, not unlike this one. The same gray light, the same cold floor, the same clock, keeping its uninterested count. She had been sorting through the pockets of Warren's sport coat before taking it to the dry cleaner, a task she had performed every few weeks for nearly 4 decades because Warren considered such logistics beneath the threshold of his attention. He wore the coat and the coat was cleaned, and the process by which those two facts were connected was something that happened in the background of his life, managed by someone whose management he had long since stopped noticing. The paper had been folded in quarters and tucked into the inner breast pocket. When she unfolded it, she had stood at the dry cleaning bag for a long time. Longer than 14 minutes. She thought now. Though she hadn't been counting, reading and rereading a number that should not have been as large as it was. For a number of nights that should not have been as many as they were. At a hotel she had never been invited to. The same hotel. A different month. She had thought, standing there with the dry cleaning bag in one hand and the receipt in the other, about all the things she could do. She had made a kind of inventory of her options the way you do when you are trying to approach something impossible with something that at least resembles reason. She could confront him. She could call an attorney. She could call her sister in Bend, who had never liked Warren, and would know exactly what to say most of it, starting with, "I told you." She could leave. She could demand answers. She could perform the scene that this discovery seemed to call for. She had done none of these things. She had folded the receipt back up. Carefully. Precisely. Returning it to exactly the shape it had been in, as if she could return it to the pocket she had found it in and pretend the finding had not happened. She had carried it into the kitchen and opened the drawer beside the stove. The drawer where the takeout menus accumulated, where expired coupons lived alongside rubber bands and a flashlight with dead batteries, and a small notepad she had bought years ago with the intention of writing things down, and hadn't. She had placed the receipt underneath all of it. She had then made breakfast. Warren had come downstairs at 7:45 as he always did. She had poured his coffee without being asked, as she always did. She had not said a word. She had told herself in the weeks that followed that she needed more information, that one receipt proved nothing that a reasonable person would act on, that she was 66 years old, with 38 years of marriage, and a life that was organized entirely around a structure that would have to be completely dismantled if that receipt meant what she was afraid it meant. And before she dismantled anything, she needed to be certain. She told herself she was being careful. She told herself she was being smart. She had told herself a great many things. 6 months after that, the second one. A credit card statement. This time, not a receipt. 3 dinners at a restaurant she had never been to, a place she had driven past once on her way to meet a friend for lunch, and recognized immediately as somewhere designed for privacy. Booths with high backs. A wine list that ran to 2 pages. The kind of lighting that told you something about the intentions of the people inside. 3 dinners, 3 separate evenings, each one charged to a card she was not supposed to see on an account that had appeared in a statement that had arrived at the house by mistake, tucked inside an envelope addressed to them, jointly mixed in with the household bills she always managed. Because Warren had told her 15 years ago that she had a better head for the household accounts, which had been true. and which had also been a way of freeing himself from a category of information he preferred not to monitor. She had put the credit card statement in the same drawer, beneath the menus and the flashlight and the first receipt, which was still there, still folded in quarters, patient as a stone. She had told herself she needed more time, more certainty, more of something she couldn't name precisely, but understood as the difference between knowing something and being prepared to do something about it. The distance between those two things had turned out to be considerable. She had been covering that distance for more than a year, one careful and inconclusive step at a time. Now she was standing here with the third one. The drawer was still there beside the stove. She looked at it. She knew exactly how to fold this paper so that it fit. She had done it before, twice. She understood the geometry of it, the particular size of the secret, the particular size of the space it could be made to occupy the way the drawer closed over it, without requiring any additional force. She had become, without intending to, an expert in the architecture of not knowing. She picked up the receipt. She held it for another moment. Warren's name, the hotel, 14 nights in a room that cost more per night than her first week's salary at the firm, where she had worked for 3 years, before Warren's career had made it clear that one of them would need to stop. She had been the one who stopped. She had been reasonable about it. She had understood that it made sense. She had told herself this so many times that she had eventually stopped being able to hear the telling. Then she did something she had not done the first 2 times. She left it on the counter, right there in the open in the pale early light where it could be seen by anyone who walked into that kitchen. She set it down flat, smoothed it with her palm, and left it like a question she was finally done pretending she hadn't asked. She went upstairs to get dressed. She had an appointment at 9 o'clock. She had met with Patricia Owens 4 times over the previous 3 months. A small office on Southwest Morrison 3rd floor, the kind of office that was organized with a precision that told you something about the person who worked in it. No photographs on the desk. A diplomas wall arranged with careful modesty. A woman who had spent 20 years doing this specific work and had developed in the course of it the particular ability to be simultaneously compassionate and completely unsentimental. Patricia had asked in their first meeting what Grace wanted the outcome to be. Grace had thought about the question for a long moment before answering. Not performing consideration, actually considering. "I want to be done," she had said finally. "I don't want to fight about the house. I don't want to spend the next 2 years in depositions. I want to be done." Patricia had looked at her steadily. "That's a feeling," she said, "not a strategy. Let's talk about the strategy that gets you the feeling." What the strategy had produced after 3 months of careful work was a settlement proposal that any reasonable person would have called generous to Grace. The house on the west side assessed at just over $3 million, her share of the retirement accounts, a monthly support figure that would maintain her current standard of living for the foreseeable future. Patricia had built it brick by brick, and she had built it well. And she had presented it to Warren's attorneys 2 weeks ago with the confidence of someone who knows the structure is sound. Grace sat in the courtroom now with her hands folded in her lap and watched the structure being negotiated. The room was smaller than she had expected. Fluorescent lighting, wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people sitting in them with hard things on their minds. The kind of room that had heard every version of every story, and had developed through sheer accumulated exposure. Something like patience. Not sympathy, just patience. The patience of a space that has learned it cannot hurry anything. Across the aisle, Warren sat with his attorney, a young man named Whitfield, who had the sharp-suited confidence of someone who had graduated near the top of his class and had not yet learned that this was not the same thing as being right. He kept glancing at his phone beneath the table, which told Grace everything she needed to know about how he expected the morning to go. Warren had not looked at her once. Not when they entered the building together, riding the elevator in a silence that was technically the same silence they had shared for years, but felt this morning like a completely different substance. Not when they were directed to opposite sides of the courtroom. Not through 35 minutes of lawyers exchanging the language of dissolution assets and entitlements, the conversion of a 38-year life into columns on a spreadsheet. He sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and he looked at Whitfield, or at the judge, or at the papers in front of him, and he did not look at her. She had known those hands for nearly 4 decades. She had watched them sign the papers on their first apartment, the papers on the Birch Street house, the papers on the West Side house that had arrived in her kitchen this morning as a $3 million line item in a settlement proposal. She had watched them hold a glass at parties and gesture across dinner tables and rest on steering wheels. And for a few years, when Callum was small, read bedtime stories to a boy who had needed to hold his father's hand while he listened. The particular stillness of those hands, when Warren had already decided something and was only waiting for the room to catch up. They were very still now. Patricia was building her case with the methodical care of a woman who trusted the foundation she had laid. Grace heard the words primary homemaker and career sacrifice and equitable distribution, and understood that Patricia was doing everything right, everything she had been hired to do, everything a competent attorney properly briefed would do in this situation. Grace watched Warren's hands and thought, I don't know this person. Not with anger. The anger had come and gone over the past 14 months, in waves she had mostly ridden alone in rooms he wasn't in. Not with grief precisely, though there was something in the vicinity of grief. The grief for what she had believed the marriage to be, which was different from grieving the marriage itself. You can't fully grieve something you are only now understanding you never entirely had. More the way you feel standing in a room you lived in for decades after everything has been moved out. You recognize the shape of the space. You know where the furniture was, but the furniture is gone, and what's left is just the room, just the walls, and the light coming through the windows. And there is something almost peaceful in finally seeing it clearly. Patricia was mid-sentence when Grace said quietly and clearly, I'd like to speak. The room recalibrated. The judge looked up from his papers. Patricia turned. Whitfield stopped typing. Warren's hands stayed flat on the table. He still did not look at her. Mrs. Holloway, the judge said carefully, your attorney. I understand. I'd like to speak. He allowed it. The way judges allow things when the alternative is a procedural argument that will take longer than the thing itself. Grace addressed him in an ordinary voice, not the voice of someone performing a scene, not elevated or theatrical, just her voice in a room saying the thing she had come to say. Your Honor, I'd like to accept a settlement of $120,000 and release my claim to the marital property. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before it. Patricia's hand found her arm immediately. Grace. Grace shook her head. Once. Small. The particular smallness of a gesture that means the decision has already been made, and this is simply the announcement. The judge was a man in his late 60s, with the careful manner of someone who had presided over enough of these mornings to know that sometimes what looks like an error is actually a conclusion. He asked if she understood what she was relinquishing. He named the assessed value of the house. He named the retirement figure. He used the word irrevocable in the precise, deliberate way of a man making certain the record would show he had said it. I understand, Grace said. I'm 67 years old. I don't have time left to spend it fighting over the wrong things. Patricia looked at her the way people look at someone standing at the edge of something very high, trying to determine whether this is a jump or a fall and what the correct response is to either. They brought her the papers. She signed where they indicated. Her signature was the same as it had always been, a clear, decisive hand. The signature of a woman who had once been a paralegal and had learned early that your signature is a representation of your seriousness. The pen moved across each line without hesitation. The soft scratch of it was the only sound in the room for the length of several breaths. The sound of a signature releasing 38 years of accumulated property, accumulated silence, 3 folded receipts, 14 months of telling herself she needed more time. From across the aisle, Warren spoke for the first time all morning. You'll regret this. His voice was even, practiced. The voice of a man who had built a career on the ability to sound like the most reasonable person in any room. When you realize what you've done, when you have nowhere to go and no one. Grace heard the words. She was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about a small house on a street called Birch, on the east side of Portland, where she had not been in 11 years. She was thinking about a key in her purse, old brass worn smooth in the cup of her palm from years of being carried without explanation. Held in quiet moments, returned without comment. She stood up. She did not look at Warren. She walked out of the courtroom into the ordinary Thursday afternoon light, and the city moved around her the way cities do, indifferent and continuous. The ordinary machinery of other people's ordinary days, turning without reference to what had just happened in a room on the 4th floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. She did not look back. In her purse was a key she had been carrying for 11 years, without ever explaining why. There was a story Warren had believed for 11 years, and Grace had never corrected it. The house at 14 Birch Street had been their first home together. They had bought it in the early years of the marriage when Warren was still 3 years from making partner. And money was something they negotiated carefully between them. Which restaurant, which vacation, whether to replace the water heater this year or next. It was a small house, 1 story, 1,100 square feet on a lot that gave you enough yard to have an opinion about, but not enough to require a strategy. The floors were hardwood. The walls were the soft yellow she had chosen herself from a strip of paint samples at the hardware store on Morrison Street. Back when choosing a paint color felt like one of the most significant decisions a person could make. She had brought the paint samples home and held them up against the wall in different light. morning light, afternoon light, the particular quality of light on a cloudy Portland day, which was to say, most days. She had thought about it for 2 evenings. She had made her choice. Warren had said it looked fine, which was the most he usually said about things that didn't directly concern him. She had been right about the yellow. It was the right yellow. She had known it the moment the first wool was done. When Warren made partner and the opportunity appeared on the west side, a house twice the size, the right neighborhood, the right address for the version of himself. He was in the process of becoming they had moved. This was understood to be the correct decision, and Grace had not argued with its correctness because it was correct. She had packed the house on Birch Street with the organized efficiency she brought to everything labeled, the boxes arranged. The movers left the rooms cleaner than they had been required to be. Warren had handled the sale, or rather he had handed it to his assistant Catherine to handle, which, in practice, meant that documents arrived and departed, and were signed as required. And Warren moved through the transaction the way he moved through most domestic logistics, with the breezy confidence of someone who has delegated the details and trusts them to be managed. What Warren did not know, what had never occurred to him to verify, because it had not occurred to him that verification might be necessary, was that Grace had, during those weeks of paperwork, retained an attorney of her own. A small practice. A woman named Judith Harmon who specialized in property law and operated with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that her clients often needed things done without explaining why they needed them done. The transaction had been restructured. The house on Birch Street had been quietly separated from the joint sale, placed into a trust in Grace's name alone through a set of legal steps that were entirely legitimate and that Grace had paid for from the household account in amounts small enough to be unremarkable in the monthly reconciliation that Warren never looked at anyway. She had kept the house. She had paid the property taxes year after year from the same account. Small amounts. The kind that accumulated invisibly in a household budget, managed by someone who paid attention to the household budget. She had kept the utilities on minimal settings enough to prevent the pipes from freezing in winter, enough to maintain the structure against the particular slow damage that befalls houses left entirely without power for months at a time. She had not visited. She had not rented it. She had simply held it the way you hold certain things you cannot yet explain the need for. She had told no one, not her sister, not her friend Janet, who was her oldest friend, and who knew most things about her life, not Patricia, who had reviewed the marital assets in meticulous detail, and had not looked in the right drawer because Grace had not opened the right drawer. She had kept it the way you keep certain things without being able to explain why, the way you hold on to a coat you haven't worn in years, hanging in a closet. You rarely open because getting rid of it would require you to say something definite about the future, and you are not yet ready to say anything definite. She had carried the key. On the days when the Calicut floor felt coldest, on the mornings when she moved through the West Side house like a person in a museum. Carefully, without touching anything that mattered, she had sometimes taken the key out of her purse and held it in her palm. Just held it, not thinking about it in any analytical way, just letting the weight of it sit there. The brass had worn smooth over 11 years, the particular smoothness of something carried close to the body for a long time. Yes, sir. She drove east through the city without the radio on. The courthouse was behind her. The signature was on the paper. The irrevocable thing had been done and done without regret, and now the car was moving through the city that was going about its Thursday the way it always did, and she was going somewhere she had not been in 11 years. The highway thinned into an avenue. The avenue softened into a street. The architecture changed: lower buildings, front yards, a different relationship between the structures and the space around them. Here, people left garden hoses coiled on the lawn and didn't think much about it. Here, porches had chairs that showed signs of actual use. Maple trees had grown up through the years according to their own intentions with no particular audience in mind. She turned onto Birch Street and slowed without consciously deciding to slow. The street was 3 blocks long and curved slightly in its middle section, which gave it a quality of being slightly hidden from the main road. A neighborhood within a neighborhood. A small, self-contained world that had been going about its business regardless of whether anyone outside of it was paying attention. She had forgotten the curve. She had forgotten how the houses on this street seemed to lean slightly toward each other, the way people do in a conversation they are actually interested in. Number 14 was smaller than she remembered, and she had known it would be. The white paint had gone the color of old paper. Not peeling, not damaged, just aged in the way of things that have been standing in Pacific Northwest winters for 30 years without being attended to. One side of the front porch carried a slight lean, the particular sag of a structure bearing weight without complaint for a very long time. The mailbox at the end of the front walk tilted at a modest angle, and at the corner of the yard, where she had no memory of planting anything, a maple tree had grown up entirely on its own initiative and had grown tall enough to throw shade across the entire left side of the house and part of the front walk. She parked and sat in the car for a moment. Outside, the street was quiet, in the way of mid-afternoon residential neighborhoods. The working people still at work. The children not yet home from school. The retired and the unhurried going about their interior lives behind windows that showed nothing in particular. A cat sat on the porch of number 16, watching the street with the attentive indifference that cats bring to surveillance. Someone had put a ceramic pot of late-season mums at the top of the steps of number 18 orange flowers, still bright against the gray November sky. Just a street, just houses, just Thursday in Portland. She got out of the car. The front walk had a crack running through it lengthwise, a fault line that had begun as a hairline fracture in some previous decade and had been widened season by season by the patient work of frost and root and rain. She stepped over it the way you step over something familiar, even when you haven't seen it in years. The body remembering what the mind has filed away. She found the key in her purse without looking for it. Her fingers knew where it was. The lock took 2 tries. She had to jiggle the key and hold the knob at a particular angle. The particular angle she remembered without having been aware that she remembered it. An old house has these requirements. It has been through enough seasons, enough contractions and expansions, enough of the slow work of wood and metal adjusting to time to have developed opinions about who it admits and under what conditions. The lock gave. The door swung inward with a sound that was not quite a creak, something longer and slower than a creak. The sound a house makes when someone finally comes back to it. A long exhale, the release of held breath, the particular noise of a thing that has been waiting patiently and is now expressing in the only language available to it that the waiting is over. Grace stood in the doorway and did not go in right away. She let the smell reach her first. Dust and closed air. and beneath both of those something else, old wood. The dry warmth of a house that has been shut through several summers. The smell of a place that has been patient. Not stale, patient. There is a difference. Stale is the smell of neglect. What she smelled was more like the smell of preservation, a space that had held itself together in the absence of anyone to hold it for. She went inside. Ooh, the floors were hardwood under a layer of grime still sound beneath it. Still the same boards she had walked across 10,000 mornings. She could tell by the particular give of them in the section near the kitchen doorway. The spot where the subfloor had always had a slight softness that no one had ever gotten around to fixing. Because it wasn't a problem yet and might never be. And by the time it became a problem, they had already moved to the west side. The walls still held their yellow, faded now less vivid than the color she had held up to the window light in the hardware store on Morrison Street 38 years ago, but unmistakably the same color, the same warmth. She had been right about it, standing here now with the gray November light coming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. She could still see what she had seen then. A house that felt inhabited. A space that felt chosen rather than merely occupied. She went slowly, room by room, the way you move through a place you need to relearn. The kitchen was to the left. The original linoleum still on the floor she had always meant to replace it had picked out tile twice, and each time decided to wait until they had more time, or more money, or more of whatever it was you needed before you replaced the kitchen floor. The faucet dripped once when she touched the handle, then went quiet, as if it had spoken out of surprise, and then thought better of it. A single cabinet door hung slightly open, the hinge loose in the way it had always been loose. She had tightened it once, and it had gradually worked itself back to this same angle, as if it had a preference. She pushed it closed with 2 fingers. It stayed. The bathroom small unchanged. The tile she had scrubbed on Saturday mornings in the early years of the marriage, before the Birch Street house had a cleaning service, before the idea of a cleaning service had become something they considered in the category of normal rather than luxury. A soap dish she had no memory of leaving sitting on the edge of the sink, as if someone had just set it down and would be back for it shortly. She stood in the bathroom doorway for a moment and thought about the Saturday mornings. The radio on in the kitchen she had always cleaned to music, the particular pleasure of a task with a clear end point and a clear sense of accomplishment when it was reached. The smell of the cleaning products she had preferred, a brand she had bought because her mother had bought it. Small things. The texture of ordinary life. She had not thought about those Saturday mornings in a long time. The first bedroom, hers and Warren's, she stood in the doorway and looked at without going in. Empty. The closet door open. The window looking out over the side yard, where the new maple threw its shadow across the wall. She looked at the room for a moment, looked at the place where the bed had been, the particular quality of the wall, where the headboard had stood for 7 years. Then she moved on. The second bedroom was at the end of the short hall. She stopped before she reached it, stood for a moment in the hallway, one hand resting on the wall, looking at the closed door with the glass knob that she already knew would be slightly loose in its fitting. She had painted this hallway too. The same yellow as the main rooms carried through, so the house felt continuous rather than chopped into separate zones of color. She remembered painting it on a Saturday in October Callum had been. 3 had walked through the wet paint with socks on. had left a trail of yellow footprints down the hall that she had photographed before cleaning up, because it seemed like the kind of thing you should photograph. She did not know what had happened to that photograph. It was somewhere in a box in a drawer in one of the careful organizational systems she had maintained in the West Side house for things that mattered but did not have an obvious place. She opened the door. The room was smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to larger things, to rooms that had been designed around a sense of proportion that assumed a certain amount of space was the baseline condition of a life. This room had 11 feet by 12, and it had been enough. It had been more than enough for a child who measured the space he needed in terms of where he could build a fort and where the trucks could go, and whether there was room to spread out a puzzle on the floor. A single window faced the side yard. The radiator beneath it still had the small chip in the paint. Near the bottom valve, Callum had struck it with something she could not now remember what, when he was 4 years old, and the chip had stayed, and she had looked at it every morning when she came in to wake him for school, and had never once gotten around to touching it up. And now 32 years had passed and the chip was still there, exactly as it had been, which felt like the kind of thing that should mean something. The closet door still had the same glass knob, slightly loose as she had known it would be. She stepped inside, and there they were, on the door frame. The frame between the room and the hallway. The pencil marks, small horizontal lines, each one precise, each one accompanied by a notation in her own handwriting. The record of a child growing up against a fixed point, measured and dated and documented with the particular care of a parent who understood that these things go quickly, and you have to mark them, or they will pass without a monument. 6 months, just above the baseboard, 1 year. 18 months, 2 years. 3 years, March. 4 years, October. 5 years. 6 years. Grace put her finger on the line marked for 6 years and held it there. The wood was smooth at that spot, slightly paler where the pencil mark had faded over 30 years but never disappeared. She could feel the slight indentation where she had pressed the pencil hard enough to make a mark that would last. She had pressed hard on all of them. She had done it deliberately, pressing hard enough that the line would be there in 10 years, in 20, in however many years it turned out to be, before someone returned to this door frame and touched the marks that were still there. 7 years, 8, 9. She moved her finger up the frame, touching each line in sequence. The years ascending toward the ceiling, each one a version of Callum that no longer existed and would never come back. 10 years. 11. Then she found the last one, near the top of the frame, close to where the door frame met the wall. A longer mark than the others, she had always given the last one a little extra length, as if she knew at the time that it was ending and wanted to give it proper weight. And beside it, in her own handwriting, clear enough, that 30 years had not blurred it, August 12th, first day of school. She stood very still. She put her hand flat against the wood around that mark, as if she needed the full surface of her palm against the surface of the wood to make the memory real. August 12th. The specific quality of that morning arrived in her memory not gradually, but all at once, the way some memories return, not a slow assembly of details, but a single complete image, fully rendered. Callum in new sneakers, still stiff at the toe. His backpack was green canvas with a dinosaur patch on the front strap that he had chosen himself, and that Grace had sewn on at his direction, and it was too large for his frame. But he had insisted on wearing it already packed, even though they weren't leaving for another 20 minutes, because putting it on had felt like the most important thing he could do with his hands. He had been nervous. She had known it immediately, not from what he said, because he didn't say anything about it, but from the particular quality of his silence. The way the air around him felt different when he was working to contain something. She had made a small ceremony of the measuring. She had gone to the kitchen drawer. Not the drawer where the receipts would eventually accumulate, a different drawer, and found the pencil she kept there. She had brought him to the frame and told him to stand straight, chin up, heels down, don't move. She had made more of it than was strictly necessary, keeping her voice light and her movements deliberate, giving him something to focus on besides the thing that was happening in his chest. There you go. Just like that. Don't move. She had pressed the pencil carefully against the top of his head and drawn the mark and written the date beside it, August 12th. Then she had stood back and looked at him, at this boy who was her son, who was nervous and brave in the way that 6-year-olds are nervous and brave, with their whole bodies, with everything they have. She had taken him to school alone. The memory arrived with a quiet force. Warren had not been there. He had had a meeting. She no longer remembered what the meeting was, only that she had been told it couldn't be moved, and she had accepted this without pushing back, because accepting things without pushing back had been, by the time Callum started first grade, something she had already become very practiced at. She had understood, or told herself she understood, which she now recognized as two entirely different operations. She had driven Callum to school alone in the car that was hers for daily logistics. She had walked him to his classroom, the two of them in a river of other parents and children. Other first days, other nervous children, in new sneakers, carrying backpacks too large for their frames. She had crouched down at the classroom door. The particular physical act of crouching down, bringing herself to his level, looking at his face at close range with the specific attention you give someone you are trying to give courage to. He had walked inside without looking back. The particular bravery of a child who has decided not to turn around, because turning around might break the thing he has assembled. She had driven home. She had come back to this house. This house, this hallway, this doorframe, and she had stood here for a long while, looking at the mark she had just made. The mark that said, August 12th, first day of school. The house had been very quiet around her. Warren's silence in the room had been different from Warren's absence. Silence was a sound. Absence was a condition. She had stood in the absence for a long while, and then she had gotten on with her day. She had not thought about that morning in 30 years. She stood now with her hand against the wood and felt the strangeness of it 30 years. And she had not once thought about it. Not the morning itself, not the specific texture of it, not the fact of having done it alone. She had filed it somewhere in the category of things that couldn't be changed, and had moved on the way she had moved on from so many things. She had become, through practice, through necessity, through the accumulation of small adjustments over 38 years, genuinely expert at moving on. He had missed it. Warren had missed the morning that Callum walked into school for the first time. with his backpack too big for his frame and his sneakers still stiff at the toe. He had missed the ceremony at the door frame, the deliberate pressing of the pencil, the date written beside the mark. He had missed crouching down at the classroom door. He had missed watching his son walk inside without looking back. He had had a meeting, and Grace had stood in this doorway alone and made the morning work the way she had made so many mornings work. And then she had put it in the category of things that couldn't be changed. And she had not opened that category again for 3 decades. Until now. She stood in the doorway of her son's old bedroom, 67 years old, in the clothes she had worn to a courtroom that morning, and she put her back against the wall and slid slowly down until she was sitting on the dusty floor. Knees up, one hand resting against the baseboard near the lowest of the pencil marks, near the mark for 6 months that Callum had been too young to stand still for, and that she had made while he was asleep in his crib, pressing the pencil against the wall at the height of the top of his head as she held him. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the floor in a long stripe. Outside, in the ordinary life of this ordinary street, a dog barked twice and stopped. A car passed at the far end of the block. The maple tree moved in a light wind, and its shadow moved across the side of the house with a slow, unhurried patience that had nothing to do with the urgency of human things. The house was quiet, not empty, just still. The stillness of a place that has been waiting without complaint for someone to return to it. The particular quiet of a space that is ready to receive something again. She had not cried at the courthouse. Her hands had not shaken when she signed the papers. She had walked out into the Thursday afternoon with her spine straight and her face composed. And she had carried everything she was feeling in the place where she had carried difficult things for 38 years. Now she was sitting on the floor of her son's old bedroom, and she was looking at a pencil mark that said August 12th, and she was crying. Not for Warren. Not for the house she had signed away that morning. Not even precisely for the marriage, for the version of the marriage she had believed in for longer than the marriage had deserved, which was a different grief than grieving the marriage itself. She was crying for the woman who had stood in this doorway alone and made the morning work, and then efficiently, quietly filed it in the category of things that couldn't be changed. She was crying because she had just remembered what it felt like to be in a place where she had once been completely herself, where the walls were the yellow she had chosen, where the marks on the doorframe were in her handwriting pressed hard enough to last, because she had understood that some things need to be pressed hard enough to last. The woman who had chosen that yellow, who had pressed the pencil that hard, who had made a ceremony out of an August morning so that a small boy wouldn't feel his fear quite so acutely. That woman had been real. She had existed with a completeness and a confidence that Grace had not felt in a very long time. Somewhere in 38 years of marble floors and quarterly landscaping contracts and hotels she had never been invited to, that woman had gone quiet. Not disappeared, not entirely, but quiet in the way the house on Birch Street had been quiet while she was gone, present, intact, holding all the same shapes, missing only the particular warmth that comes when someone is actually living inside a thing, rather than merely occupying it. She sat on the floor until the light changed, until the long stripe across the floor had moved to the far wall, and the room had settled into the particular dimness of late afternoon. The dog down the street had stopped. The car had long since passed. The maple tree had gone still. The street had taken on the quality of early evening, the working people coming home, lights appearing in windows, the neighborhood gathering itself back together after the dispersal of the day. She would need practical things: a sleeping bag, coffee, food, a list of what the house required and what she could manage and what would have to wait. Tomorrow these things would need to be addressed. But tonight she was simply here, in the house that had waited for her, in the room where her son had grown up against a doorframe year by year in pencil marks. She had pressed hard enough to last because she had always understood at some level that did not require words that certain things needed to be preserved against the passage of time. The brass key was in her purse on the floor beside her. She had been carrying it for 11 years. She looked at it where it lay, old brass, worn smooth, and she understood that she had not kept this house out of strategy or planning or any deliberate preparation for an exit. She had kept it because some part of her had known in the wordless way that the body knows things before the mind is ready to name them, that she would need somewhere to be. Herself again someday. Today was someday. The afternoon light went long and golden, and then faded. Grace Holloway sat on the floor of 14 Birch Street, with her back against the wall, and her hand near the lowest of the pencil marks, and she did not rush any of it. She had been in a hurry for 38 years. She was done being in a hurry. She did not hear the knock at first. She had been awake for some time already, lying on the sleeping bag she had brought in from the car the evening before, in the darkness of the small bedroom, with the pencil marks watching the ceiling slowly emerge from the dark as the first gray light pressed itself against the window. The house had made sounds through the night, the particular vocabulary of old structures, the language of wood and pipe and settling foundation, expressing the temperature change between the middle of the night and the beginning of morning. The floor near the bathroom had contracted with a soft, definitive tick just before 4 o'clock. The radiator had made one sound brief and declarative around 5. She had not minded any of it. She had lain there and listened and thought, "This is the most honest conversation I have been part of in a very long time." The knock came again, not urgent. The knock of someone who has decided to try but is entirely prepared to be turned away, who will not take the absence of an answer as anything more than absence. Grace stood, pulled a cardigan over her shoulders, and went to the front door in her stocking feet. The woman on the porch was somewhere in her early 60s, solidly built, with the kind of face that had made peace with itself several decades ago and had not reopened the negotiation. She was not pretty in the conventional sense, and was not trying to be, which gave her a quality of being entirely herself that Grace found in that particular moment almost startling. She held a loaf of bread wrapped in a blue dish towel. The bread was still warm. Grace could feel the warmth of it from 2 feet away where she stood in the doorway. The woman said, "Saw your light on last night. I'm Bev, number 16. She held out the bread. That was all. No careful head tilt. No, "Are you all right?" offered in the tone that means I have assessed your situation and found it concerning. No elaborate attempt to show that she had noticed and wanted Grace to know she had noticed. Just the bread and her name and the number of her house. An offering without conditions attached to it. Grace took it. They ended up sitting on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit. Grace had thought to bring a camping stove in her overnight bag, the one practical thing she had remembered alongside the sleeping bag, and a change of clothes and a paperback she had not opened. She boiled water on the stove and made coffee, guessing at the ratio, and it came out strong enough to be considered an opinion. Bev sat with her legs crossed and held the mug in both hands, and looked around the room the way a person looks at a place that has been something, and is on its way to being something again. Not with pity, not with the particular kind of careful attention that is really just pity wearing different clothes, but with the interested, non-judgmental look of someone who has done a version of this herself and remembers what it looked like from the inside. She did not make it into a question. She mentioned things about the street in a matter-of-fact way, the way you brief someone on local knowledge when you know they'll need it. A man named Desmond Hines at number 9, who grew tomatoes with the seriousness of a man who considered it a discipline, and who sometimes left a bag of them on your front step without knocking or leaving a note, which Bev had taken a season to understand was his version of friendship. A woman named Lorraine Pruitt, who ran the community garden at the end of the block. Bev described her as not unfriendly, just careful, which was a distinction that Grace understood immediately and valued for its honesty. A hardware store 2 streets over on Hawthorne, locally owned, that gave senior discounts on Tuesdays and employed a man at the counter who could usually tell you what you needed before you finished describing the problem. She did not ask what had brought Grace here. She did not ask about the circumstances or the empty house or the sleeping bag on the floor of the back bedroom. She simply gathered and offered what was useful and left the rest alone. She broke the bread with her hands, tore it cleanly along the grain, the way someone does when bread is simply bread and sharing it is simply what you do without ceremony or drama, or any suggestion that the act was larger than itself, and set half on the floor between them on the blue dish towel. They ate. The coffee was too strong. Neither of them mentioned it. 20 minutes, maybe a little more. Bev set down her mug and rose to her feet with the ease of someone who has accepted the limitations of her knees without making them a central fact of her existence. At the door, she paused. "I moved here 7 years ago," she said, not looking back into the room, looking at the door or at the porch beyond it, or at some middle distance where the words were easier to find. "Alone. First loaf of bread I got came from a woman named Clara, who lived next door at 15. She passed 2 years back." A small pause, the exact length of a breath. "I still make an extra loaf sometimes." She left before Grace could assemble what to say. The door closed. The house settled back into its quiet. Grace sat on the floor with the coffee that had gone lukewarm, and the remaining half of the bread, and the dish towel and the morning light coming through the windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. And she felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not comfort exactly. Something quieter than comfort. Something that had to do with the fact that the woman at number 16 had come to her door with bread and had asked nothing and had stayed exactly long enough and had left at exactly the right moment, as if she understood from experience from her own 7 years on this street from Clara, who had brought a first loaf and was now gone exactly what was needed and what wasn't. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down the block. The sound of a neighbor attending to an ordinary task on an ordinary morning. Not special, not significant, simply present. She had not heard that sound in a very long time in this way. At this proximity, the clean, uncomplicated sound of a neighborhood going about itself. She sat on the floor and listened to it and felt for the first time in longer than she could calculate something that contained elements of grief and relief and something else. Something that might, given enough mornings like this one, become ordinary. The possibility of ordinary. She had forgotten or not allowed herself to remember how much she had once valued ordinary. Lorraine Pruitt was 71 years old and had the posture of a woman who had decided several decades ago that slouching was a form of surrender she was not prepared to make. She looked at Grace with the specific quality of attention that a structural engineer might give to a wall. Not hostile, not warm, just measuring. Assessing load-bearing capacity before committing any weight. She had the eyes of a woman who had been disappointed enough times to have developed a careful preliminary protocol, and who was not apologetic about it. She did not say hello. She said, "Are you planning to stay or are you just passing through?" Grace looked at her steadily. "I don't know yet, but I'm here today." Lorraine held her gaze for a moment, testing not threatening, and then turned back to her plants, with the finality of a woman returning to work that was not going to do itself. Grace was assigned the row of beans running parallel to Lorraine's. Someone handed her gloves. She didn't see who she was looking at the row at the particular way the light came through the greenhouse panels at the back of the lot and lay across the beds. And she thought about Harold, whose name she did not yet know, whose hands she did not yet know had been in this soil. The garden occupied the lot at the end of Birch Street, where the road curved and dead-ended a corner piece that had probably been designated for something municipal at some point and had instead become this raised beds in organized rows, a composting station near the fence, a small shed with tools arranged on pegboard with the outlines of each tool drawn in marker, so that what was missing was immediately obvious. The kind of organization that comes from people who have learned through trial and error what works and what doesn't, and who have committed to what works. 12 people worked through the morning. They moved quietly the way people move when they know what they are doing and have no need to demonstrate the knowing. An older man in rubber boots who handled the hose with the precise economy of someone who understood water as a resource rather than a given. A woman in her 50s who worked 2 beds over from Grace with a focused intensity that communicated clearly that she was not there to socialize. The rhythmic sound of tools on earth, the occasional quiet exchange between people who had been working together long enough to communicate in shorthand. Grace worked the beans. She went slowly, which was the right way to begin. She learned the row which plants were doing well, which ones were struggling, where the soil was compacted and where it was soft and receptive. She pulled weeds carefully, distinguishing them from the plants they grew beside, with the attention of someone who was aware that she was still learning the difference and could not afford to be careless. 2 hours passed without a word between her and Lorraine. Near the end of the morning, Grace pulled at what she was certain was a weed at the base of a bean plant and felt resistance and looked down and understood with a sinking recognition that she had gotten hold of a seedling instead. Young, maybe 3 inches. She had pulled it halfway out before she noticed. She froze. Lorraine's hand appeared beside hers, appearing with no announcement, no preamble. Not touching Grace's hand, simply appearing beside it, and then one finger pointing down at the small depression in the soil where the seedling had come from. Grace pressed it back in, worked the soil around it with her thumb firmly but carefully, the way you would work soil around something you almost destroyed, and now need to give every possible chance. She stayed there for a moment after the seedling was replanted, her thumb in the soil making sure. Lorraine's hand withdrew. They kept working. At the end of the morning, Desmond Hines came to stand beside Grace at the outdoor tap. He was somewhere around 70, moving with a deliberate economy that spoke of a man who had learned not to spend more than what the task required. He wore a cap that had been through enough weather to have developed its own character. He spoke quietly, not looking at her directly. "Lorraine's husband, Harold, passed last year," he said. "Cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to the end." He paused. "He planted that row of beans." He walked away before she could respond. Grace turned off the tap. Her hands were still wet. She stood with them wet and looked back across the garden to where Lorraine was still working, bent low over the row, her hands moving through the leaves with the same patient, unhurried certainty she brought to everything she did in this garden. She had not stopped working. She had not paused to watch Desmond speak to Grace, or to monitor whether the information was being received in the intended way. She was tending what Harold had planted in the soil his hands had turned, and she was doing it with the same total attention she had been giving it all morning. Grace had put her hands into someone else's grief without knowing it. She had worked beside it for 2 hours. She had almost damaged it, had nearly pulled something of Harold's out of the ground before Lorraine's hand appeared beside hers. And Lorraine had not said anything, had just pointed at the soil, had just shown her where to put it back. She looked down at her own hands, the glove marks still faint on her wrists, the soil still under her thumbnail where she had pressed the seedling back into the ground. Some losses don't announce themselves, she thought. They just show up every morning and get to work. She thought about the drawer beside the stove, about folding things carefully and putting them where they fit without requiring acknowledgement, about the years of getting up and making the morning work and not saying what the morning had cost. She put the gloves on the pile with the others and walked back up Birch Street toward number 14. Yeah, the call came on a Thursday evening. Grace was at the kitchen table with a bowl of soup assembled from what she'd found at the corner market on Morrison. The kind of soup that is more intention than recipe, that works not because of what it is, but because of the warmth of it and the fact that you made it yourself in a kitchen that is becoming by degrees your own. She had been thinking in the wandering way you think when the evening is quiet and your mind needs somewhere small to go about the side yard. Whether it got enough afternoon sun for tomatoes. Desmond had mentioned a variety he grew. She had been turning the question over, the way she turned practical questions over now, with a kind of careful pleasure, as if the solving of small problems was a form of exercise she had been neglecting for a long time, and was now beginning to rebuild. The phone lit up. Callum, 32 years old in Chicago, who called on Sundays in the mid-afternoon the way a responsible son maintains a reliable connection with a parent whose life he does not fully know. This was Thursday evening. Grace set down her spoon and understood before she answered that Thursday evening was a different category. Mom, careful. The careful of someone who has been rehearsing. Hi, sweetheart. I talked to Dad. She waited. He said you walked out of the settlement. that you refused what the lawyers had agreed on and just left. He said you gave up the house. A pause that had something in it, not quite accusation, not quite confusion, something between the two. Is that true? She told him. She kept her voice even, and her account orderly, the receipts, all three of them, over 14 months. The drawer beside the stove. She told it in sequence. She did not ask him how he felt about it. She gave him the information and let him have it. When she finished, Callum was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, the particular breathing of someone who is deciding how to say the next thing. Then, "Do you have any proof of this, or is this how you're seeing it?" The kitchen was very still around her. She heard the word proof and thought about the drawer she had left behind. The takeout menus, the expired coupons, the 3 folded receipts. Still there in the house she had signed away that morning in a drawer. She had not opened for the last time but had simply left. She had the receipts. They were evidence. She had chosen for reasons she could explain and reasons she could not to bring them to this conversation. "I know what I found," she said. "Dad says there's another explanation. He says you were already looking for a way out, and that this was Callum. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying that without something concrete, I know what I found." He didn't push further. But the silence that followed was not the silence of belief. It was the silence of someone who has decided not to continue arguing a position they haven't abandoned. The call ended the way calls end when both people have run out of the words that would actually matter, a few careful sentences. A promise to talk again, a goodbye that arrived with the particular flatness of something unresolved, a connection that made a sound when it closed. Grace set the phone on the table. Her son, 32 years old, and in the careful architecture of his doubt, the reasonable tone, the insistence on concrete evidence, the framing of his father's version as equally plausible, she had heard something she recognized. Not the words, the structure, the way of approaching a claim, not to understand it but to evaluate it, the way of holding yourself at a manageable distance from the person who is trying to reach you. She had sat across from that structure for 38 years. She knew its rhythms. She knew the particular quality of the silence it produced. Not with surprise, with the sinking, specific recognition of knowing what is coming next. She picked up the bowl and carried it to the sink. The water ran cold at first, then warm. She added soap. She washed the bowl, rinsed it, set it on the rack. And she stood there, with her hands still in the water. She picked up the bowl, washed it a second time. The window above the sink was dark, her own reflection in it. The yellow kitchen walls behind her. The small house around all of it. She looked older than she felt. Or she felt exactly as old as she looked, and had simply stopped paying attention to the correspondence between the two. She washed the bowl a third time. It had been clean after the first. She turned off the water and stood in the quiet kitchen with her hands on the edge of the sink. She understood clearly and without drama that the wound of the evening had not come from Warren, who had done exactly what she had expected him to do. The wound had come from Callum. She had been bracing for her husband's damage for years. She had not known until this moment how entirely unbraced she was for her sons. She had not accounted for this. She would have to. Yeah, Warren came on a Tuesday. She heard the car before she saw it, the sound of an engine that had never learned these streets moving through the neighborhood at the pace of a man who is somewhere he did not plan to be and wants the fact registered in the way he arrives. She was on the front porch step with the second coat of paint on the fence rail, working the brush carefully along the grain, the way the man at the hardware store on Hawthorne had told her to work it. She kept painting when she heard the car slow. She kept painting when she heard the door open and close. Warren stood on the sidewalk and looked at number 14 with the expression of a man looking at something he had prepared himself for and finding it simultaneously better and worse than he expected. Then he came up the front walk, ironed shirt, good shoes, the assembled presentation of a man who had decided that even a drive to this part of the city required the proper version of himself. His eyes moved across the front of the house, taking inventory, the way they always had, the slight lean of the porch, the fence that was now a brighter white against the weathered post, the two mismatched plastic chairs she had found at a thrift store on Division Street for $11 the pair, the mailbox she had straightened last week, which still listed slightly, but was better than it had been. He stopped a few feet from the porch steps. Helen, he caught himself. Grace. Warren. He looked at the paintbrush, at her clothes which had paint on them in 3 places, and had been through the washing machine enough times to have developed the comfortable softness of things that are used rather than maintained. At the house, behind her. I wanted to see how you were doing, he said. I'm doing well. Thank you for coming. He put his hands in his pockets. She recognized the gesture. It was what he did when he was about to say something he had prepared. You don't have to live like this, he said. Whatever happened between us, I want you to understand that. I'm not trying to leave you with nothing. She heard what he said. She heard underneath it what he meant. That this, the paint on her hands, and the plastic chairs, and the small house on the ordinary street, was a condition to be addressed. That her presence here was a problem he was generously offering to solve. That the okayness she appeared to be standing on her porch step, painting her fence on a Tuesday, was a data point that didn't fit his model of the situation. And he had driven 40 minutes east to recalibrate. Would you like a glass of water? She said. I was about to take a break. I'm fine. He stayed where he was. She dipped the brush and kept going. In 38 years of marriage, she had set down whatever was in her hands when Warren walked into a room, set it down without deciding to, put aside the book, turned off the television, folded the work she was doing back into itself, and gave the room to him. She had done it so consistently for so long that it had stopped being a decision and had become simply what happened the way a door opens when you push it. Not because the door decides anything, but because that is what doors have learned to do when pushed. Today she kept painting. He talked. He mentioned the settlement in the way you mention something you know is a live wire carefully approaching from an angle. He said Callum was worried. He said she needed to think practically about what came next, because the money wouldn't sustain this indefinitely, and the house would cost more to maintain than she was probably accounting for, and there were better options if she was willing to approach things with clear eyes. She listened. She worked the brush along the rail, getting into the corner where the wood met the post, finding the angle that got paint into the grain without pooling it. At some point, he stopped mid-sentence. She felt it before she looked up the particular quality of a silence that means someone has noticed something they were not expecting to notice. She glanced over her shoulder. He was looking at her hands on the paintbrush, at her on the porch step still not having moved. His expression was not anger. It was something more complicated and less legible, the expression of a man whose working model of a situation has encountered a fact it cannot account for, and who is not certain what to do with the discrepancy. One beat. Then he continued. Something about the winter. Something about heating costs in an older house. She did not explain herself. There was nothing to explain. She had simply continued doing what she was doing. The act contained its own explanation for anyone willing to understand it. He left 20 minutes later. Said he hoped she'd think about what he'd said. She told him she would. He walked back to his car at the measured pace of a man who has not gotten what he came for, and is not entirely sure what it was he came for. The car door closed. The engine started that sound she had known for 30 years. The particular sound of that particular engine at the particular moment it came to life. She had heard it pulling into their driveway late on Tuesday evenings. She had heard it in the mornings. She had heard it cutting off at the curb of restaurants and at the parking structures of office buildings. And now she heard it move away down Birch Street, getting smaller. And she watched the corner where it turned. And then it was gone. She watched the corner for a moment. Then she dipped the brush back into the paint. The second coat wasn't going to finish itself. And the work was good honest about what it was asking, nothing more complicated of her than attention and patience, the willingness to slow down and let the brush do what a brush was designed to do. She kept painting until the rail was done. She stood and rolled her shoulders. She looked at the fence in the late afternoon light. Better. Not done, not perfect. Better than it had been yesterday. That was enough. She found the shoebox on a Sunday morning working through the hall closet. She had been moving through the house systematically for 3 weeks. The methodical approach of someone working from a list that is long enough to require a system. The bathroom faucet fixed with the help of a video she watched 4 times before attempting it. The kitchen window frame repainted on a Tuesday first coat, uneven because she rushed it. Second coat slower and better. The recessed light in the ceiling that had not functioned since she moved in, which required 2 trips up the ladder and 1 trip down for the tool she'd forgotten, and which now worked and cast its light across the kitchen floor in the particular way that working lights do, without drama, without announcement, simply and sufficiently. Her hands were different. There were calluses where there hadn't been before. She kept finding paint in the creases of her knuckles no matter how carefully she cleaned up afterward. She had stopped minding. She had started in a way she had not anticipated to like the evidence. The calluses meant she had done something. The paint in her knuckles meant the work was real. The shoebox was on the highest shelf. The place she had always reserved for things she was not ready to look at, the upper atmosphere of the hall closet. Accessible only with intention, requiring the step stool she had found in the kitchen and the deliberate act of reaching. She pulled it down and sat on the floor with it in her lap, inside a diary with a blue cover. The kind sold in the stationery section of drugstores. Nothing special. A pen clipped into the spine, the ink long since dried. And underneath the diary, folded small, a piece of notepaper. In her own handwriting, a grocery list. Milk, bread, call the dentist. The ordinary record of an ordinary day that had no idea what was coming. She set the grocery list aside. She opened the diary. The first entry was dated 14 months before she had left the West Side house, written in the period after the first receipt, in the days when she was still telling herself she needed more time. She recognized her own handwriting and felt the strange, disorienting experience of reading words written in a different version of your own life, like finding a letter from someone you used to know, except the someone was you. She had written about the receipt, about standing in the kitchen holding it, about the drawer and the decision to put it there. She had written around the fear rather than directly at it, circling, approaching, never landing on the thing she was actually afraid of. She had been a paralegal for 3 years. She knew how to write around a difficult fact. But one sentence she had written plainly: "If I don't look at it, perhaps it isn't real." She turned pages. The handwriting changed. The letters got smaller as the months went on, and the pen pressed harder into the paper. She could feel the indentations on the back of each page, the marks of a hand that was working to stay steady and expressing the effort in ways the writer probably hadn't noticed. The second receipt. 3 paragraphs, and then 2 of them crossed out with a single decisive line, the way you cross something out when you've read it back and found it dishonest. What remained was one sentence I told myself I would know when it was time. After that, the entries came less often. Weeks between them. A month. 6 weeks. The writing of someone who had started a conversation with herself and was finding the conversation harder to continue. As if writing it down made it more real, and more real meant she was closer to having to do something about it. And she was not yet ready. She read the entries slowly in the Sunday morning light, with the house quiet around her, and the maple tree visible through the kitchen window, its branches mostly bare, now the last of October's leaves gone. She read her own words from inside a life that was now 2 full chapters behind her, and felt the strange specific grief of recognizing in the careful evasions of her past self how much work it had taken to stay still. The last entry was dated her 65th birthday. She read it twice. It was the most honest writing in the diary, the kind that comes when you have stopped performing even for yourself, when there is nothing left between you and the page but the thing you have been not saying. She had written about Warren and about Callum and about the house and about the woman she had been before she became the woman who put receipts in kitchen drawers. She had written about the morning she had taken Callum to school alone, which surprised her. She had not thought she remembered it. At the bottom of the page, the last 2 sentences: "Today I promised myself I would be braver. I don't yet know what brave looks like." She turned the page. Blank. She turned another. Blank. She fanned through the remaining pages with her thumb, page after page of white, waiting for entries that had never come. The diary was still more than half empty. She had started a conversation with herself, and then on her 65th birthday had made a promise, and then stopped writing entirely, as if the promise had used up everything she had available for honesty that year, and the 2 years after it. She sat for a long time with the closed diary in her hands. She had written the promise at 65. She had kept it at 67 on a Thursday morning in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. 2 years between the promise and the keeping. 2 years of empty pages. 2 years of getting up every morning in the house with the Calicut floor and making the day work, and telling herself she was still deciding. Waiting for courage, she thought, is just another name for fear. She had needed the third receipt. She had needed 3 years and 3 pieces of paper, and the accumulation of enough weight that the drawer finally stopped being an option. She had needed to be completely ready, because she had been carrying it completely alone. She looked at the diary on the kitchen table in front of her. The plain blue cover, the ordinary construction of it, the unremarkable container for 2 years of a woman's careful and difficult truth. Better late, she thought, than the alternative. Outside, the maple tree moved in the morning wind. Yeah, nobody planned the Friday. It assembled itself the way certain evenings do, through small gestures that don't look like planning from any individual angle, but add up in aggregate to something that was clearly meant to happen. Bev appeared at the door in the late afternoon with a bottle of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, and the question of whether Grace had plans delivered in the tone of someone who has already predicted the answer and shown up accordingly. Grace said she didn't have plans. Bev came in. Lorraine appeared 40 minutes later with a ceramic dish covered in foil, which she set on the table and then sat down beside without waiting for a specific invitation. Which was, Grace was beginning to understand simply how Lorraine conducted herself in the world, arriving where she had decided to be, and arranging things as they needed to be arranged without making a discussion out of it. Desmond came because Bev had called him. He brought a cast-iron pot of something he refused to identify until everyone had tried it, which he explained was a principle rather than a game. Garrett Caldwell, Bev's son, who had appeared 2 weeks earlier to fix the side gate that had been hanging from a single hinge since September, and who had done so without much commentary, and with the unhurried competence of a man who has learned not to make tasks larger than they are, had apparently told his mother he might come by. He did. 7 people in a kitchen built for 2, maybe 4, if nobody moved at the same time. They pulled the table out through the back door and set it up in the yard. Bev produced string lights from a bag she had apparently planned to bring and then pretended she hadn't planned produce them, with the confidence of someone who has learned that string lights are always correct and requires no defense of their presence. They hung the lights between the 2 trees that flanked the back fence. The yard looked in the particular way that certain spaces look when they are being used as they were meant to be used, like exactly the right place to be. The laughter started somewhere around the second glass of wine and didn't really stop. Grace sat at one end of the table and listened to it move around. The particular quality of laughter among people who are still in the early stages of knowing each other, still generous, still surprised by what's funny, before the familiarity of long acquaintance has settled in and made everything a little more predictable. Desmond's pot turned out to be lamb stew made from a recipe his wife had kept in a card box in the kitchen for 30 years, which he had been making from memory since she passed with adjustments he considered improvements. Nobody who ate it disagreed, though. Lorraine's assessment came entirely in the form of a clean plate, which Bev later said was Lorraine's highest register of praise. The cold came in at the edges of the light as the evening went on, but nobody moved inside. They added layers, a cardigan, a borrowed jacket, a scarf retrieved from Bev's bag, which also contained a second pair of gloves, because Bev was the kind of person who prepared for the cold without making a point of it, and they stayed where they were. Grace sat in the warmth of the person on her left, who was Desmond, who radiated heat in the way of a large man who has spent his life doing physical work and whose body has calibrated itself accordingly. She ate Desmond's stew and Lorraine's dish, which turned out to be a sweet potato gratin assembled with a precision that told you something about the person who had made it. She drank the wine Bev had brought and listened to the evening, and felt something she had not felt in long enough that she had to think for a moment to name it. She was not managing anything. She was not occupying a space, carefully attending to what might be touched and what might not. She was simply at a table in her own yard, with people who had shown up without being formally asked, eating food made by hands that knew what they were doing under lights strung between two trees. She did not think about Warren. She noticed this fact, held it for a moment, and then let it go, because it didn't require anything of her. It was simply true. A quiet, unremarkable fact about a Friday evening in October in Portland, Oregon. The evening went on until it ran its natural course, which was late enough that the cold became an argument too large to ignore. Garrett loaded his truck. Desmond carried his pot. Lorraine collected her dish without ceremony. Bev stayed to help Grace bring the table back inside, and they worked together in the way of people who have passed the point of requiring instruction for shared tasks. When Bev left, the house was quiet again, but it was a different quiet than it had been a month ago. So, Callum had chosen the restaurant, which told her something. A place near the center of the city, quiet at lunch, the kind of space chosen when a conversation needs to happen in a controlled environment. Neutral ground. Easy exit in any direction. Grace arrived first. She had dressed that morning not for the lunch, not for anyone she would see there, but for herself, the particular difference between those two things becoming something she was learning to feel, rather than simply understand. She had stood in front of the mirror for a moment before leaving, and had looked at the woman there without apology. Warren arrived next. He came in and looked around the room before sitting the old habit, the automatic surveillance of who might be present, who might see him, what the optics were. He nodded at Grace. She nodded back. Callum came in from the cold with his coat still buttoned the way he buttoned it when he was tense, without having registered the tension yet. He was 32 years old, and looked in that moment very much like the boy who used to stand in doorways, deciding whether to enter the same quality of holding himself at a threshold. He sat down between them. Not beside Grace, not beside Warren, precisely between, equidistant. The geometry of a man who has decided that the fairest thing he can do is not choose. Warren ordered water. Callum ordered coffee. Grace ordered nothing, and the server, who understood something about this particular table, moved quietly away. Warren spoke first. He was good at this, the measured opening, the tone of careful concern, the framing of what he preferred as what was reasonable. He said Grace needed proper support. He said the house on Birch Street was a temporary arrangement, not a long-term solution. He said he was concerned, and that Callum was concerned, and that there were options available if she was willing to approach the situation with clear eyes and practical thinking. He said all of this in the voice of a man who believes he is presenting facts. Callum's coffee arrived. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He did not look at Grace. She watched her son's hands. She had known those hands since they were small enough to disappear inside her palm. She had watched them learn to hold a pencil, learn to catch a ball, learn to move through the world, with the particular confidence of someone who has been in most of the ways that matter adequately loved. She knew the way they moved when he was listening with full attention. She knew the way they stilled when he had already decided something and was waiting for the moment to say it. They were very still now. Warren finished. The pause that followed was the kind that expects agreement, or at least the performance of reconsidering. Grace reached into the bag beside her chair. She set the blue diary on the table between them. Not in front of Warren, not in front of Callum. In the center, visible to both, belonging to neither, simply present. She did not open it. "You asked for proof," she said. She was looking at Callum. "Nearly 2 years, in my own handwriting. Everything I found and everything I told myself about why I wasn't ready yet. Everything I circled around and wrote toward and wrote away from." She put her hand flat on the cover of the diary, palm down steady. "In that house, while I was still living in his." Callum looked at the diary. His hands tightened slightly around the coffee cup. Warren did not look down at the table. He kept his eyes on Grace with the particular controlled stillness of a man who has decided not to react and is working at the effort of it. The diary sat between them without needing to be opened. The fact of it was the statement. The plainness of it, ordinary blue-cover drugstore paper. The unremarkable container for 2 years of a woman's careful and honest accounting of her own life, said everything that the diary's contents would have said without requiring anyone to read it. Callum opened his mouth. Grace stood up, not angry, not performing anything, simply done with this particular room, this particular conversation, this particular configuration of 3 people at a table where the important things had already been said, and the things that would come next would not be important. She put on her coat. She picked up the diary and placed it back in her bag. She looked at Callum, at his face, which she loved, which wore an expression she recognized and understood, and could not fix, and which was not her job to fix. "You don't have to agree with me," she said, "but I need you to know I don't need to be rescued. I just need to be believed." She looked at Warren. 38 years. The marble floor, the landscape garden, the receipts folded in the drawer. The morning she had stood alone in a doorway after taking their son to school for the first time in new sneakers with a backpack too big for his frame. The morning she had not thought about for 30 years until she stood in that doorway again and finally had the room and the silence to think about it. "I hope you find what you were looking for," she said. No anger in it. No performance of forgiveness either. She was not there yet, and she was not pretending to be. Just the truth stated in her own voice by a woman who was finished carrying something she had never been meant to carry alone. She said goodbye to Callum. She meant it, and she walked out through the lunch crowd and the cold air coming through the door, and the ordinary Wednesday street that led back toward the east side, back toward Birch Street, and the house that was learning to be hers, back toward the door frame with its pencil marks and the gate Garrett had fixed, and the garden at the end of the block where Harold's beans were tended by a woman who did not require acknowledgement for her grief. Behind her, for the first time in 38 years, Warren and Callum sat across from each other, without her between them. She did not look back. She sat on the front porch steps with her coat still on, and the afternoon light going long and thin across the street. She had driven home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, letting the city move past her windows. A woman pushing a stroller. 2 men in conversation outside a sandwich shop. A pigeon working its way along the gutter with the focused industry of something that has exactly one thing to do and is doing it. She had expected to feel lighter. She felt present instead, which was different from lighter, and which she was learning to recognize as the more honest version of what she had been looking for all along. Not the weightlessness of having put something down, the groundedness of standing in the place where you actually are. She had been prepared to lose her husband. She had not been adequately prepared for what it would feel like to sit across from her son and see in his face the careful distance he had chosen. She was his mother. She had spent 32 years understanding that to be his mother meant she could fix things, that the relationship between them was one of the things in her life that was not broken. She understood now that she could not fix this one, that fixing it was not, in fact, what she was supposed to do. That what she was supposed to do, the thing she had been failing at for years, the thing she was only now learning to attempt, was to be truthful about her own life, and then to let Callum find his way to truth in his own time. At 32, he was young enough that there was time. She would wait. She heard Bev's door open across the street. She did not look up. She heard the footsteps on Bev's porch on the front walk crossing the street. And then Bev was sitting down beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, without asking, and without offering anything except the fact of being there. They sat. The street went through its late afternoon changes around them, the light flattening and going gold. A car passing at the far end. Somewhere down the block, a porch light coming on, though it was not yet full dark. The maple tree in the front corner of the yard throwing its shadow long across the ground. Bev did not ask what had happened at the restaurant. She did not ask about Callum or about Warren. She simply sat. The way people sit who have learned that presence is sometimes the whole of what's needed. That there is a particular kind of help that is made smaller by being explained or qualified, or accompanied by language. The cold came in as the light faded. Neither of them moved. 3 days later, Grace was sweeping the back step in the thin morning light when she heard Lorraine's voice from across the street. Lorraine was in her front yard with a trowel and a pot of late-season mums. She did not look up from what she was doing. Her attention was on the pot, on the placement of it, on the angle of the mums against the light. "Same time Friday," she said, in the tone of someone who has made a decision and is informing the relevant party. Grace looked across the street. "Yes," she said. Lorraine nodded once, the specific nod of a woman who has concluded business and sees no reason to extend the transaction. She went back to the mums. Grace stood on the back step with the broom in her hand and looked at the yard around her. The gate Garrett had repaired, which now opened and closed without the protest of a hinge, bearing more than it was designed to bear. The maple tree fully bare now, its branches clean against the gray November sky, beginning its long, patient wait for spring. The beds along the fence where the soil had been turned and left to rest, where she would put tomatoes in May when the light was right and the ground was ready. She had spent 38 years waiting to belong somewhere. She had waited for belonging to feel like an arrival, a specific, recognizable moment, unmistakable like a door opening onto exactly the right room. It had not come that way. It had come like a loaf of bread wrapped in a blue dish towel still warm. Like 2 hours of silence working a row of beans beside a woman who was tending her husband's grief without saying so. like a bowl washed 3 times in the dark of a kitchen that was becoming by degrees her own, like string lights between 2 trees on a Friday no one planned, like a man she did not know making stew from a dead woman's recipe, like a neighbor saying same time Friday in a tone that meant you have passed some test you did not know you were taking, and you have passed it by showing up. Grace leaned the broom against the back wall and went inside to put the kettle on. The house received her the way it always did now, with the quiet steadiness of a place that had waited a long time and was not going to make anything of the waiting, not performing welcome, simply open, simply warm, simply hers. The kettle came to a boil. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the blue diary in front of her, not open, just there, and she drank her tea slowly and watched the afternoon light do what it always did in this kitchen. At this hour, coming through the window at its particular angle, crossing the floor in a stripe that moved slowly toward the far wall as the minutes passed. She had lived in a house with Calacatta marble floors for 20 years. She could not remember once stopping to watch the light move across them. She watched it now. On Friday, she would go to the garden. She would work the row beside Lorraine in the silence they had developed together. Not the silence of strangers, not the loaded silence of people avoiding each other, but the working silence of people who have found a rhythm and trust it. She would put her hands in the soil and do the careful work of tending something, and she would make mistakes and correct them and move forward. At the end of the morning, she would wash her hands at the outdoor tap and walk back up Birch Street to number 14, and the porch steps would take her weight on the left side, and the kitchen faucet would require a full turn past where it felt finished, and the bedroom window would need the particular combination of lift and push. She had learned through repetition, through getting it wrong and trying again. She knew this house now. She knew its requirements. She knew what it asked of her and what she could give it. She was learning slowly and by the same method. Trial, attention, correction, persistence to know herself in it again. The woman who had chosen the yellow. The woman who had pressed the pencil hard enough to last. That woman was still here. Had been here all along, waiting in the way that certain things wait, not desperately, not demanding, just present and intact, holding the shape of what she was until someone came back to inhabit it. The light moved across the floor. The tea cooled in her hands. The street outside was quiet and ordinary and entirely hers. Same time Friday. She was already looking forward to it.